thanks everybody for joining me in this complicated time, in this complicated way. I confess my own days are not much different than they always are. I spend them alone in my office with my imaginary friends, writing books about them. But I miss so many people right now, and so it's particularly nice for me to be able to connect with you all here. So thank you, Marcy, and for everybody who arranged this, and thank you all for showing up to chat here. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes with some visuals, and then I would love to chat further with you about anything you'd like to talk about. So please think of your questions, throw them in the chat. I think Marcy will throw them to me after I'm done presenting. Okay, without further ado then, I'm going to go ahead and set this screen share, which hopefully this will work. Let's see, go here. This is about a 4-step process, so hold on here.
We can
oh, it's in full screen already. Oh, great. Okay, I thought I had to go to full screen, but okay. Wait, then that's not okay. So this is the first image, and I'm gonna ask you to just take a look at it. And if we were in person, I would have you shout out what you think it is, but you'll shout and I won't hear you. So just think about what it is, and I will tell you. If you speak German, it'll be easier. It's a Band-Aid box. And I'll tell you that in all the research I did, seeing this very late in the game at an exhibit in New York was one of the most moving. I actually stood in front of it in this exhibit in New York and wept. And the docent brought me a little tissue and said, yeah, the Band-Aid box, that gets everyone. It seems so weird to be weeping over such an ordinary thing, but I hope for those of you who haven't read the novel that you will understand after you have how a simple, ordinary thing can be so moving. I will tell you for those of you who've read the book and you're thinking, where was that Band-Aid box? That Band-Aid box is not in the novel anywhere. I didn't see this until it was too late to work it in. It's the kind of detail that I love to work in, but the book was already basically done and still I was researching it, so there you go. All right. So raise your virtual hand if you know who this woman is. And while you're doing that, I will take this opportunity to thank the NIOD of the Netherlands for allowing me to share this photograph. If you're not raising your hand, you're not alone. Her name is Truce. She is a hero on the scale of Oskar Schindler of Schindler's List fame, and she is so completely forgotten that even and everyone at my Dutch publisher, she is Dutch, so my publisher in the Netherlands, HarperCollins, so not a small office, nobody there had ever heard of her until they read The Last Train to London. I'm going to speak a little bit today about how this novel started for me. Spoiler alert, not with Truce. And the real story behind it and how hard it was to dig out that story. But I'm going to start with about 2 minutes of how I started writing. And this is novel number 7, so if any of you have heard this, bear with me, I will be quick. I'm going to start by saying if there are any teachers or librarians in the listenership here, watchership here, I hope you will feel very much my appreciation for you after I've done this little bit. So this is me, Sierra Madre Library, circa 1970. I'm 11 here. We've just moved to a new neighborhood. And I'm in my 2nd year of braces and just about to go on that most horrible of trips for a girl not yet in the 6th grade to buy my first brassiere. We'd moved to Los Angeles for 6 months. It was only going to be 6 months into a neighborhood without any kids. And so I was left to the mercy of my 4 brothers and the company of books. The lucky thing for me was that my local library was having a reading contest, and all I had to do to win was read the most books. Well, I will tell you, I'm very type A, and so I chose short books. And finally, some of the librarians there saw what I couldn't see, which was that I was reading about twice as many books as anybody else, and started putting bigger, better books in my hands. Books like A Wrinkle in Time and To Kill a Mockingbird. And in reading those kind of books, I began to imagine myself a writer. So fast forward 2 years. Not quite 3 years. I'm in the 8th grade, and I'm asked to stay after school by Mrs. Thompson, who is, I will tell you, as formidable as she looks in this picture. Don't be fooled by that smile. I was a good student, but not always well behaved. And I had indeed that day been chatting with my friend Colleen Gibbons during the spelling test. So I assumed that was what Mrs. Thompson wanted to ask me to stay for, but she didn't ask Colleen to stay. And it turned out she wanted to talk to me about a poem I submitted, and she wanted to encourage me to submit it for publication. So I submitted it to the only publication that I knew published poetry, which was 17 magazine. Well, they rejected it. It turns out 17 publishes poems by Pulitzer Prize winning poets and not generally stuff written in purple ink on lined paper by 14-year-old girls. I will tell you, it was 20 years before I ever submitted anything again. But in case you don't think that teacher praise meant the world to me, I want you to notice that I still have this copy of this poem with my teacher's writing on it almost a half a century later. So thank you, teachers, librarians, for inspiring us. I literally would not be a writer without that kind of support. But if you want to do anything creative, don't follow what I did there. Don't wait 20 years before you ever submit anything again. Instead, listen to this guy on the left. It's my husband, Matt Clayton. And late one night when I was done lawyering and when he was done lawyering and I was still doing it, he poured me a glass of wine and asked me if there was anything else I'd like to do in my life. Well, I'll tell you, I was a merger and acquisition lawyer, which means a 100-hour week was not unusual. And so mostly he wanted to see me every once in a while. He was the one who came home and let the nanny go at the end of the day. But I, had worked hard for that law degree. It was the only thing I really knew how to do. And so I said, oh, yeah, hard fought law degree and all that. He said, forget about what you can do, what you know you can do. If you could be anything in the world, what would you be? And I said, well, without missing a beat, if I could be anything in the world, I'd be a novelist, but that's going to happen. And he said, how are you going to know if you can do it or not if you don't give it a try? So I didn't exactly, leave my day job the next day. And when I did, I'll tell you, it took me 10 years to get my first novel published. But here I am with book number 7 and in the unbelievably miraculous position of being able to call myself a novelist, which is as much fun as those of you who've ever imagined being one is. So, okay. So The Last Train to London. It's based on the true story of the Kindertransport rescue of some 10,000 children in the years leading up to World War II, and one extraordinary woman who led the effort. Otto Frank, now I always butcher this quote, so let me read it. Otto Frank believed in learning lessons from history rather than learning history lessons. So as a history major, I learned a lot of history lessons, but I will tell you that the things I learned about history mostly came from novels. I learned a lot about World War I from Erich Remarque's extraordinary All Quiet on the Western Front. I became fascinated with Russian history after reading Tolstoy's War and Peace. And I know what I know about the Holocaust largely from the writings of Elie Wiesel. What a novel does differently than a history text is invite you to inhabit a life or lives, to imagine yourself walking in those shoes. Also, you don't need to memorize anything, so that's kind of nice. But it does require you to open your heart to other people's experiences. Fiction is sometimes called the lie through which we tell the truth. But for me, at least, it's the lie through which I feel the truth. I take it into my bones, I take it into my heart, and it makes me want to be a better person. So the best introduction I have to this novel is literally 30 seconds, and I'm going to roll that for you if I can. There we go. Oops, wait, oh, I did that wrong, hold on. I'm supposed to go, this is the trickiest part of this thing is getting to the next slide, hold on. There we go, okay. I meant to say before I started that, that is actually real footage of some of the kinder leaving Czechoslovakia. My story is about the kinder out of Vienna. There was no footage of them, but I like to share that to show, these real children, this is a real experience. So The Last Train to London is sometimes called Truce's story, and it is that, but as I said, it didn't begin for me with Truce. It began for me more than a decade ago when my usually chatty, then teenage son arrived home troublingly silent. He was a very voluble kid. He would literally ride his bike home singing at the top of his lungs, almost no matter what time it was. So the neighbors always knew when he was coming home, which, as you can imagine, when he was a teenager was a lot of fun for everyone. But this day he came home and he did not say a word. I thought maybe a girl had broken his heart for the first time or something. And finally I asked him if he was okay. And he said, yeah, he was just digesting something that had happened. It turned out he had come from our local children's theater where he had interviewed by then an 80-something woman who'd been separated from her family when she was 9 years old. So I first began to learn about the Kindertransport effort in an effort to help my own son understand what he was learning about. I did not know about it before then, even though I was a history major, and that was the first I'd heard about it. Nick and his theater friends would go on to interview 4 women saved by the Kindertransport: Ellen Fletcher, Helga Newman, Elizabeth Miller, and Margot Lowry. Before they could write their play, they were researching and going to write and perform a play. Their director died of stomach cancer, and the kids ended up scattering off to college, as kids do, and the play never did get written or performed. But I was left haunted by this story. I was left trying to imagine myself as a mother putting a child on that train, sending them off to a place where they didn't know the language or necessarily have anybody to love them. And I was left trying to imagine what it would be like to be those kids climbing on that train, leaving everything they knew and loved behind. But for the most part, as I was researching this novel, it was nothing more than a fascination for me. I read books, I watched documentaries, I eventually watched and listened to interviews of the Kinder, but I wasn't thinking that I would be the right person to write a book about this attempt organized largely by Jewish people in Britain, including this man, Norman Bentwich, to rescue largely Jewish children from the Reich. Here's a little secret: I'm not Jewish. So I learned fairly early on about a guy named Nicholas Winton, who maybe some of you have heard about. He led the Prague rescues, the Prague Kindertransports, and that gave me the idea that somebody must have led the Vienna ones as well. And so I went looking. I will tell you, it was truly years into my looking before I stumbled upon the name Truce Weissmuller. After I had her name, I found an entry in Righteous Among Nations, which you probably all know, but I'll say because not everybody does. It's an honor bestowed on Gentiles who helped save Jews. It didn't even include the word Kindertransport. I would not have found it just Googling Kindertransport as I had been. But it did say that Truce was a non-Jew with access to the Nazi power structure. That was her advantage. So I'm not Jewish, but neither was Truce. Neither were a lot of people who risked their lives to help others. And so oddly, as daunting as Truce is, I mean, she's a truly extraordinary woman, I was suddenly less daunted about taking on this story. So here's another little secret: I'm not Dutch either. And that definitely posed some problems in the research, which I'll get to in a minute here. So The Last Train to London, it's both the story of Truce and the many people involved in the extraordinary effort to rescue these children. And it's also the story of the children and their families. I started writing it where it started for me, with the children and their families. So what I did was I collected some photos around me, including this photo, which I used to shape my character of Sophie Len. Sophie is a teenager. She's a math prodigy. She's the child of a Nazi journalist, and she's a Christian. You might notice from this picture that this child is not a teenager. She is not the same hair color as my Sophie. She's not the same nationality. And she's not the same religion, but she did evoke in me a sort of love when I saw this picture that poured out of me into the character of Sophie Len. So that's what I'm looking for when I'm looking for inspiration, things that rip my guts out. So I didn't actually even know who she was as I was writing the novel, and that works to my advantage in a lot of ways because I can imagine who she might be. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum identified her only as refugee girl. But after I was done with the novel, when it was all done, I went looking to see if I could figure out who she was. And I found in the Bullmash collection at Kenyon College that she is indeed Helga Kreiner from Berlin, and she was on the first Kindertransport, December 2nd, 1938, from Berlin. So in my novel, my Sophie meets a slightly older boy named Stefan, who is again not this boy, but this picture evoked in me a kind of affection, I will say, that helped me create Stefan. Stefan is an aspiring playwright who, unlike Sophie, has lots of friends. These children, Sophie and Stefan, are based on research, hundreds of hours spent poring over survivor memories of, recorded histories, oral histories, just anything I could find. But they don't actually exist anywhere except in my mind, on the page, and if I've done my job well, in the reader's mind and heart. Again, I hope this novel makes you feel what this moment in history was like. I hope it helps you feel, and not just learn, but take into your hearts what it was like to close, what it means to close our borders to refugees and to close our hearts to people who need our help. I also hope, and this is where Truce comes in particularly, to give everyone, including myself, the feel of how extraordinary it is to do something courageous and selfless, which is, what Truce did. Atticus Finch, in one of my own very favorite novels, one of those ones that those librarians put into my hands, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, describes courage not as a man with a gun in his hand, but rather it's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. And that's the kind of person that Truce is, or was. So Sophie and Stefan do things that kids do everywhere, like ride this Ferris wheel in Prater Park, which is still there. And I don't suppose it'd be giving too much away to say that one of these teenagers might become sweet on the other. I actually only ever meant them to be friends, but teenagers will be teenagers. Stefan's father is a prominent Vienna chocolatier. And the reason I did that was because, well, if I'm writing a book about a Vienna chocolatier, then I go into a store like this, and any piece of chocolate can be expensed in the name of research. Must be tasted as should everything that is not Viennese chocolate, because you have to know whether Viennese chocolate is the best or not. Well, so actually, the reason I made Stefan's father a prosperous chocolatier, a chocolate store owner, is that I wanted to show that the Jewish population of Vienna at the time before the Anschluss was integrated into Vienna society and very, very successful. And is there a more evocative way than to say, give you a taste of that through chocolate? Before Hitler invaded Austria, more than half of Vienna's bankers, lawyers, and doctors were Jewish, along with half of its journalists. Hitler was just across the border, but here's the thing. At first, Hitler was seen as a joke. Even after he was made chancellor, people thought it was a passing madness that would be, soon pass. And he was across the border from the people in Austria. It was hard for people living their daily lives, raising children, going to school, running businesses, to imagine that he would cross the border into their lives and put them in jeopardy. The change that occurred in Germany over literally decades occurred in Austria over literally months. When 1938 opened, Austria was a free and independent country, even with its Nazis largely behind bars. In March, Hitler walked in, took over the country. By November, Kristallnacht was happening with the burning of the synagogues. So that's how quickly it changed. That's all in 1938. So Stefan's father's chocolate business has underneath it an entrance to a fairly amazing underground world that really underruns Vienna. There are tunnels of various sorts. Some of them are man-made. Some of them, they actually rerouted the river, so some of them are from that. Some of them are natural, and some of them are sewers, which, as you can imagine, smell just lovely. There's a 3-story underground area that used to be a convent. There's an underground area that used to be a Talmud school. And there's even a place that used to be an underground horse stables. There's a crypt. And not all the bones are in coffins. Oops, wait a minute, I did that. And so what better place for a teenager to take their first kiss than in the scary underground where guys like Orson Welles hang out. This is literally Orson Welles from a movie called The Third Man, which was filmed in this Vienna underground just after the war. And so it gave me an opportunity to see what they looked like then as opposed to what they look like now. One of the loveliest things about being a writer is being able to read in the afternoon and call it work, and occasionally to be able to watch movies in the afternoon and call it work. This book actually started for me with, I wrote it as a screenplay. I'd never written a screenplay before, but for a lot of reasons I'll answer later if you want. I wrote it first as a screenplay, and by some small miracle, long story short, a later version of that screenplay was selected by the Writers Lab, which is a Meryl Streep and Nicole Kidman sponsored effort to bring more women's voices into film. So now I'm working on it. I get to work on it with literally an Oscar-nominated screenwriter, so that's pretty cool. Anyway, so 1938, Hitler crosses the border and takes Austria. People in Vienna begin to realize that they need to leave, but by then borders are mostly closed throughout the world to Jews, whose passports Germany was soon stamping with the J you see in the upper left-hand corner there, marking on the girls' the female passports, Sarah, and on the male passports, Israel, as if a whole people could be reduced to a single name. People could still leave if they had somewhere to go, but mostly they did not. So after Hitler invaded Austria, parents began running ads like this in the British papers. It says, urgent, director of Viennese chocolate factory, whose circumstances are sadly depleted due to the political situation, is extremely anxious to place his son with refined and charitable family. Boy, age 10, is of bright and happy disposition. I'll tell you that I had already made Stefan's father a chocolatier when I saw this ad. And so that is not a reflection of just a happy coincidence. It's a reflection of how many ads there were placed like this. It was not that hard to find somebody who was a chocolatier. So, whenever I see this ad, it breaks my heart to think about as a mother writing something like that for my own child. So into this void of children in peril steps Truce Weissmuller. She's begun rescuing children from Nazi Germany, but in small numbers, 1 or 3 or maybe 5 or 6. Those organizing the Kindertransport wanted to rescue thousands. So I started looking around for information about Truce, and I will tell you, I could find absolutely nothing. It was December 2016, so 8 years after I'd first learned of the Kindertransport and I started researching this, before I came upon this notice of the publication of a biography of sorts of Truce. Despite the notice being very conveniently in English, the book was only ever published in Dutch. It was 50 years out of print by the time I found it, and there were no copies for sale anywhere in the world, and only about half a dozen copies anywhere in the United States, all in libraries. The closest to me, I'm in California, was 2,000 miles away. But my older son's college across the country had a copy. And so I called him up and said, Chris, could you do me a favor? Just check this book out of your library and photocopy it for me and send me the photocopy. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And I thought, oh yeah, he's just started this very swanky PhD program and he thinks he's the last person in the door and not belonging there and he's going to fail. And he doesn't have time to spend, 2 hours photocopying a book for his mom. But what he said to me was, Mom, you're a lawyer, copyright laws? And I said, oh, well, you know, 50 years out of print and it's in Dutch. And he said to me, quoted back to me a line that I used to quote to him all the time when he was growing up, which is, if you lose your integrity, you lose everything. So he found out from his college how much he could photocopy for me legally. He got me this table of contents. I Google translated it and tried to decide on the basis of that which chapter would be the best pages for me to ask for to begin with, at least. The 29 pages that Chris could get me were in Dutch, which I don't speak or read, hence the problem not being Dutch for this. And actually they turned out to be in Dutch and German, which was a challenge for the amazing translation team of Google Translate and me. It was actually in the early days of Google Translate, so it really sucked. I had a nice conversation with somebody who's very high up in Google, whom I know, who told me to hold on. They were improving it, and it has greatly improved since I did those first pages, even between when I did the first pages and when I did the whole book. But this, you may not know, it's actually in Dutch and German, some of the dialogues in German. So I would run it through Google Translate. I would get total gibberish, and I would realize there was some German there. I would take it apart, you know, take out the German, translate that, take out the rest, put it all back together. And that's how I got a very, very bad translation of this book. But even with that translation, there turned out to be just this incredible, incredible passage about how Truce faced down Adolf Eichmann in order to get these children out of Vienna. Oh, you know, I'm so... this is Eichmann as a young married man. He's actually just getting married. I'll tell you that he's a guy who loved his wife. He had children. He loved his children. He loved his mother. He had a Jewish best friend when he was growing up. But he was, you know, a young, ambitious, and his ambition led him to be the guy you know of as the one who developed the final solution. He was the man in charge of Austria at the time that Truce was asked if she would help approach him about getting these children out of Vienna. And I will tell you, for any of you who've read that book, that the scene with Eichmann is very much the way it actually happened in real life. So I didn't even have to make up very much there, as extraordinary as it is. I just had to bring it to life, basically. Well, so Toni Morrison once said that if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, you must write it. This was a story that I now had to read, and I'm just going to say Toni Morrison has had both a Pulitzer and a Nobel, and so yeah, I do listen to her writing advice at every opportunity I get. And I also hope you appreciate that nice segue away from Eichmann, who's just an ugly, terrible dude, to this very nice photograph of the Herengracht in Amsterdam at about the time that the novel takes place. I got to go to Amsterdam, and I was interviewed by the head of the Anne Frank Institute, which was truly an honor. And I did an event in Belgium at the Holocaust Museum there, but I got to stay on this canal, really overlooking just about this spot. It was really very fun. So I enlisted a Dutch friend actually to help me find a copy of Truce's book. There were none in her local library. She couldn't find one to buy anywhere. Her husband, who's a techie guy and can do anything in the world, assured me that there was not a copy to be bought anywhere in the world. But my friend Muriel got a different library in the Netherlands to send her library a copy of this book. She checked it out for me and she copied it page by page. You'll be very glad to know, before you worry about her integrity or mine, that it turns out to be legal in the Netherlands to copy an out-of-print book. So she sent it to me and I Google translated it paragraph by paragraph, and that's how I got the basic research for Truce. That was about all there was that I could find for Truce. Armed with that, I began writing, and this is the way this is part of the way I write. You know, when people ask me how I write, I do just about anything I can. But one of the things I do is I do what I call my card outline, and I take these, you know, little 3x5 note cards, like I used to use to make term papers, and I just write down ideas and throw them down. Maybe this would happen. Maybe this would happen. I write it down, throw it on the floor. What that does for me is it gets the editor off my shoulder, because I'm going to tell you, anything that's just an idea can seem at some points in time like the stupidest idea in the world. Even the greatest ideas in the world sometimes seem like the stupid ideas. So that's what I do, and then I end up making an outline, and it becomes, eventually looks like this, and I'll tell you, each of those cards is a scene or a chapter, actually a chapter in the book. So that's one of the ways I write. I'll tell you that the real story of Truce Weissmuller and these families is truly inspiring and uplifting. You know, the risk that these people took for total strangers to help bring total strangers to safety is just truly extraordinary. And I truly feel like we need more like that in this world we live in today. I am so humbled by the responses to the novel. It's been a Jewish Book Award, National Jewish Book Award finalist in the book club category. Thank you guys all for that, if you had any hand of that. It's a Historical Novel Society Editor's Choice, a bestseller in the US and Canada, in Truce's own country of the Netherlands, which pleases me to no end. That little red sticker you see on that first little book to the right was the biggest TV show in the Netherlands, featured it on their once monthly book club show. So it was like getting Oprah of the Netherlands. That was very fun. But I will tell you that most humbling to me has been the responses I've received from some of the real kinder, some of the real people who were saved. That's not supposed to be that. Oh, that's Truce's statue. Oh, that's a new statue of Truce that's just gone up in the Netherlands. So she's getting to be more known there. I'm so happy about that. So that is one thing that really makes me so grateful. But it's people like Marianne Wolf, who was number 211 on that first Kindertransport from Vienna that I write about. And she emailed me, and she just had one question, which was, why the book was shelved as fiction, because it was so like her own personal experience. This guy on the left here, his name is Philip. He came to a reading that I had in Southern California. And I will tell you that he was about the age of Walter in the book when he left Vienna. And he is just as you would imagine Walter would grow up to be. He's warm and charming and funny and just absolutely just a lovely man. We stayed and talked for a long time after my reading there, and it was really an honor to meet him. These are the Oppers. The person on the left there is Gertrude Ruth Friedman Opper. Her daughter on the upper right there, Erica Opper, brought this photo to me at a reading that I did in Northern California. And she gave it to me, and she said her mother was on a 1938 Kindertransport from Vienna. And she wanted me to have this. She said, these are, in her words, 4 generations who would not exist but for the goodness of strangers. And this guy in the middle here, this amazing man in the middle, his name is Paul Alexander. Paul lives in Israel. The book is coming out in Hebrew. It actually sold at auction in Israel, which is really cool. But it's not out there yet. But somebody in the United States read it in English and sent it to Paul because they knew his story. Paul turns out is somebody who was put on a Kindertransport when he was 1 year and 7 months old. So he wrote me after he had read it to say, I've just finished reading it. Actually, I didn't read it. I cried all the way through it. I've read many books about the Kindertransport and the Holocaust, but your book, written so sensitively, is really special and meaningful to me. It touched my heart from beginning to end. Thank you, Meg, for writing this book, and I can confirm, as you hope in your dedication, that your book more than does justice to my own story. I'll tell you, this photo is of Paul and his son and his grandson, and Paul is in his 80s in this picture, and he is retracing the path that his train took to take him to freedom. Well, you know, when he was in his 80s, he biked all that way. Honestly, if I had imagined these real people and their families reading my novel, I'm quite sure I would have been far, far, far too daunted ever to have begun writing it. But I am so grateful, so very grateful to be part of telling this story. You know, it's Truce's story and that of the children who were involved, all the families who were involved. But as I wrote it, I held in my heart the silence of my own son, that moment he first came home and told me about the Kindertransports. I hope, as Paul sent his email, and as I say in my book, that it does the real families justice, and that Truce will inspire everybody as truly as she inspires me. And that's it for the slides. And I would love to chat about anything that you guys would like to chat about.
Wonderful. I've got some questions here. I know we have a couple questions that have popped up. I'm going to ask you one of those first.
Yeah.
Eileen is asking, excuse me, my allergies are kicking up today. Are you aware that President Franklin Roosevelt was asked to up the quota of Jews allowed into the US before World War II, and he would not? That is why the children did not leave England for the US until well after the war.
Yes, actually, one of the things, one of the little known facts is there was actually a bipartisan bill presented in both the Senate and the House to do something similar to the kinder transports to bring children to the United States. And that request ended up on, support for it ended up on Roosevelt's desk. And there's a copy of it that is marked file no action with his initials. So he just, it was not something, we think he was a hero and he did some great things. But even in the US, anti-Semitism was on the rise, as it was everywhere in the world. And it was not our finest hour any more than it was anybody else's. There was a whole effort, worldwide effort to try to open borders to the Jewish population of the Reich. It was called the Evian Conference. And the end result of all these countries coming together to figure out what else they could do to help was absolutely nothing. Just nothing. Nobody stepped up to say, yeah, I could do something. We could do something here. We have room for people. It's a very, very sad bit of history, and one that I think is really, really important for people to know now, especially.
I couldn't agree with you more, and hopefully we have learned from the past and won't repeat the same mistakes, and will rectify some of that somehow.
Yeah.
Stephanie is asking, and I love this question. Stephanie's in my book club.
Hi, Stephanie.
She's asking, do we know anything about Truce's life after the story ends? Does she end up having any of her own children?
We do know a lot about Truce's own story, and one of the things we know is that she does not actually ever have her own children. So it's interesting that bit of this novel is, as you can imagine, a woman in her time, if she didn't have children, she may not even have known why she couldn't have children. She probably didn't. And it certainly wasn't anything that was spoken of. It was just not in polite society did you speak about your difficulty in having children. So very little is known about why she didn't have children. We do know that she died childless. And so that is one of the places where, as a novelist, I take some liberties, because I know what I know about Truce's life, and I am true to that in the scope of the novel. But those spaces where I don't know, that's where I fill in with fiction. So, for example, the things that happen to Truce in the book in terms of her own family, I know something about Joop from her book, but the intimate details of their personal life are largely fiction. Yeah. There was another part to that question, and I think I didn't answer it.
Do we know anything about Truce's life after the story?
Yeah, so we do know. I'm going to say that I seriously toy with doing another Truce book, because she did so much stuff. It was just quite amazing. She was, she stayed, at the risk of a spoiler alert for some people who haven't maybe read the book, she did, as she does at the end there, stay in the Netherlands for the war. She had the opportunity to leave, and she decided to stay. She did that because, as she said, there were a lot of children who still needed her help, a lot of people who still needed her help. She was arrested again in the south of France, trying to get, she was taking food to people in camps there, in Gurs, which is a camp in western France, and helping to get people out. She again talked her way out of it. And so she stayed in the Netherlands the entire war. She went on to do a whole bunch of things. Among other things, she was on the Amsterdam City Council. Still, for whatever reason, she was completely forgotten by the time, I got to her. So.
It makes me want to do my own research about her life after reading your book and hearing you talk about her, because she's so fascinating. She's such a strong woman, and her character is, and probably as well as in real life, is just, she's just such a fascinating character. She's very complicated, and you did a tremendous amount of research for this book. Was there anything that was just really interesting, that was fascinating to you, that you weren't able to include for one reason or another?
Well, I have to say that if it's really fascinating, I try to find a way to work it in. So maybe not. Certainly, I would like to have explored more of what Truce did afterwards, and so that's, you know, maybe I'll do another book on her. We'll see. Um, there were. It's interesting, the whole research process. I mean, one of the things I love about writing fiction is you get to learn whatever you want to learn, and you follow things where your interest leads. And I literally would keep a list of, keep a list of interesting things that I would like to work in somewhere. And so sometimes when I'm revising, I end up taking out a whole chapter, and I'll take out that whole chapter and I'll go, oh, but you know, there's this thing that's there, and I really want to use that somewhere. And so I'll just hold that aside and figure out a way to work it back in.
Now, as you talk about your writing process, it's really interesting because it mimics a lot of creative processes, and I know that because I paint is also. And when you're talking about your writing process, it mimics so much of what I think is my painting process, in terms of getting your ideas out there, and I scribble a bunch so that I'm not, I'm not in my head so much. And you mentioned, getting the editor off your shoulders.
Right.
And then there are pieces that you want to keep, and there are pieces that you don't like, and then sometimes you cover something up that you didn't mean to cover up, and it's the same thing. It's all part of the creative process.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the good thing for me is, I mean, in painting, if you cover it up, you can't just, uncover it. In writing, I can just set it
or
aside.
if your child paints over it. That has happened.
I'm sure it has. I think it's really interesting how the creative mind works. I recently connected with, there's a nod in the book. The character of Walter, I will tell you, don't tell my mother. My mother thinks that Walter is named after her father, who was indeed named Walter. But in fact, Walter is named after Walter Cohen, who's a real Kinder. I didn't know him, but I knew of him, learned of him, and he went on to win the Nobel Prize. This was going somewhere. Where was it going?
Creative process.
Oh yeah, so creative process. So I was talking I connected with his family. He passed away about 5 years ago, but his family, one of his family members reached out to me, and I ended up having a Zoom with a whole bunch of them. And it was really wonderful. And his granddaughter said, I can't remember if it was a granddaughter or his daughter said, the way you talk about writing is sort of like the way Dad talked about science. He's obviously this very creative guy. And I know I have a son who's a very mathy economist now. And I know from listening to him that the way he works is also in some ways the way I work. And you just really have to embrace the idea that things can sound like bad ideas even when they're brilliant ideas, and run with them. So yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the hardest part of writing, honestly, is to embrace that, to have confidence that you can do something with something.
I know we have a couple of writers on this call right now, so I'm sure that they appreciate all of this that you're talking about. And actually, one of them is asking right now, Stefan received a book when he was in the holiday camp. I think it was called Kaleidoscopes.
Yes.
So he thought Sophie had arranged for him to get it via her mother. I think it was Tante Truce. She was there when it was ruined and knew about him from Sophie. Can you please tell me who sent it to him? Thank you.
That is very good. That's a very insightful reader. And you just answered the question yourself, which is that the person who delivered that book, provided that book for him, was indeed Truce. It's interesting because there's two, I have two versions of this story in my head now, and one of them is the screenplay version, and one of them is the book version. And so that's something that's done fairly subtly in the book, and you might not I think most readers have, I do this every once in a while in a book, and I have something that's pretty subtly done. And if readers say, can you tell me? I say, can you tell me? And they always have the right answer. So it's something that you think you know, but you're not sure you know. And anyway, in the screenplay, because as my Robin Swicord, who was Oscar nominated for the Curious Case of Benjamin Button, is helping me with this screenplay. And what she told me was, a screenplay is a novel is basically a thing of beauty, and a screenplay is a blunt instrument. And you just can't be subtle in a film in the way that you can in a book. And she told me about why, which I thought was really interesting, which she said, in a book, if the reader is not sure of something, they can flip back the pages and reconsider what they've learned. She said, in a film, even streaming now, you're always watching with somebody or something, and you can't just rewind the film. Certainly, when you're seeing it in a theater, you can't rewind the film and see what's going on. So your reader has to know at every moment where they are and what has happened. And so there's just not the room for subtlety in film that there is in books. It's too bad, because I love that bit of subtlety, but I understand what she's saying. So yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah.
She's a teacher and a writer, if you couldn't tell from the question.
Very good. I would say for all the writers out there that if you're trying to write, really, you just have to keep believing in yourself. Trying to get published, you have to keep believing in yourself way past the time when your own mother has given up on you. You just, it's really hard. As I think I said in there, it took me 10 years to get my first novel published. And that was after, I will tell you that I wrote a first novel, and I was done with it after about 3 years after I started writing, and I sent it to, I submitted it to agents, and I had multiple agents who wanted to represent it. And then it just didn't sell to publishing. So there's so many ways that you are diverted in the writing path, and it's really very hard to break in. So if you're not breaking in immediately, don't assume it's because you shouldn't be a writer. Assume it's because the right person has not read your work yet. And when the right person reads your work, you have to get your work as good as you can, but then when the right person sees it, they will recognize it, they will help you make it even more, extraordinary and help you get it out there. But you just really have to keep believing.
Absolutely. You mentioned a little bit, maybe some hesitations that you had about writing this book because you weren't Jewish, and so can you talk a little bit more about that and how you considered that and wrestled with that? Because you've had a wonderful response, especially from everybody, but the people who were on Kindertransport have really embraced this story. But I would love to hear a little bit more about your struggles when you first were deciding to write this story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up Irish Catholic. My dearest uncle was a priest. That's how Irish Catholic we were. And I know and I will say also that I grew up Irish Catholic with Jewish best friends. So, when I was in church on Sunday morning, they were in Hebrew school or whatever. And when I was in catechism on Saturday mornings, they were in synagogue. So what I know from growing up Catholic, even though I'm no longer a practicing Catholic, is how very steeped I am in my religion in ways that I don't even realize. So there's my world presumes some things that had I not grown up Catholic, I would not presume. And I know that because, I have so many good Jewish friends. I know that is true of the Jewish faith as well. And so I was very nervous about taking on what I saw at the beginning as a Jewish story, because, how do you write this story without some of these characters being Jewish? And I would think of it as the main characters, the main kids being Jewish. And so I literally, when I found out about the story, I was talking to my agent about, what I was going to write next. And I was actually already writing something else under contract, I think with Random House. But I said, Marley's Jewish. Her name is Marley Russo. I said, Marley, there's just amazing story. And as near as I can tell, nobody's written it yet. So I know you have some great Jewish writers. Wouldn't you like to give it to one of them? And Marley said to me, you need to write that story, Meg. This is before I even found Truce. I said, I can't write this story. I'm not Jewish. And she said, yeah, you need to write that story. I'm not giving it to anybody else. You need to write that story. And she would, I did, from the time, let's see, if I found this in 2008, I published 3 books in the interim. So wrote and published 3 books in the interim. And every time I would say, this is what I'm going to write next. And Marley would say, you need to write that kind of transport story. So I don't know. It's hard to take it on. I mean, what if I got it all wrong? It would just, it's such an important story, and it was so important that it be done. I felt it was so important that it be done right. So, I mean, so it really truly was finding Truce and realizing that, yeah, I might not tell the Jewish side of the story as well as a Jewish writer would, but I might tell Truce's side of the story as well or better, because that's some stuff I understand. That kind of opened it up for me. And then I'll tell you that you make choices based on what you can do and what you can't do, right? So I did not grow up Orthodox Jewish or even Jewish. I went to a ton of bar and bat mitzvahs when I was a kid, and I had way more fun than I at any one of them than I ever had at a confirmation. But I don't know what it's like to be Jewish. So, for example, one of the nice things about Vienna is, from a Christian writer standpoint, and not a Gentile writer standpoint, we'll say, is that a huge portion of the Jewish population by then was not strictly religious. Many of them were even practicing Christians. I mean, honestly, I'm sure you all know this, but there were people who had converted to Catholicism and become priests who died in the Holocaust. I mean, it was just a thing that makes no sense. But so I made Stefan's family. They have a Christmas tree. As did my editor at HarperCollins is a woman named Sarah Nelson. She's just absolutely lovely. And she said, well, I'm so glad you gave him a Christmas tree because, I grew up with a Christmas tree and people seem to think that's weird, So
my grandmother had a Christmas tree.
Yeah, right. So anyway, so that makes, if you make him, if I made Stefan a kid who was not steeped in Jewish religion in the way that, say a boy from Chaim Potok's novels would be, then it's easier. It's easier to bluff your way through it, I guess, is what I would say.
You did a really great job with it, and you presented it in a way that was very, not only was it very readable, but it was interesting and accurate, and it was not from a place that felt pejorative or questionable in terms of motives or anything like that could happen if you're writing about an experience that maybe isn't your own. Because it can get a little dicey with that, and you did it extremely well, I have to say.
Thank you. I do think it's really interesting. There's so much, there was a book, the title of it is escaping me now, but it was a book about the Hispanic immigrant experience that's gotten some press for being maybe not authentic or whatever. I think that if we are all limited to only telling the stories that we know well, you wouldn't have complicated stories, because there is no story that's a complicated story that doesn't involve, most complicated stories involve multiple individuals with multiple views of the world. And if you cannot step into somebody else's shoes and imagine what their life is like, I mean, that's what literature's for all of us to be able to step into other shoes and imagine what it's like. So I do think it's just respect is so important in that situation. So thank you. It did, I have to say, I think it helped a lot. Both my agent and my editor are Jewish, and so having their, I can't actually think of anything where they said you shouldn't say this, but just having their take on it was really helpful for me in terms of the confidence that it would be okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really lovely. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here tonight on Zoom with me and having this conversation. If you have not read the book yet, The Last Train to London, locally, you can get it at Novel. They'll do curbside pickup. You can call them and you can pay for it over the phone, and they'll run it out to your car for you. You can also get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and places like that, but locally you can get it at Novel. Fantastic book. I couldn't read it anymore. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. And I just want to echo to everybody what Marcy said, that if you can buy it locally, do buy it locally. Your local bookstore is where every writer gets their start. It's so important to the vibrancy of our literature to support independent bookstores. So please, if you can do that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.